And to help us dig deeper into that big meeting, we have with us Brian Wong, fellow at the Center on Contemporary China and the World at the University of Hong Kong. Brian, what's really at stake in this meeting? Are we looking at meaningful progress or just an effort to keep tensions from deteriorating?
Well, thank you very much, Grace. And I think it's important to bear in mind that in international geopolitics, there's a huge difference between the signal and the noise. There's a lot of noise about this summit. Trump himself floated talking about China's domestic political situation, negotiations over sales of arms to Taiwan, and of course, the possibility of a border investment, even though Trump hasn't himself mentioned it. All of these agenda items have been floated around in the noise. But I would be very cautious to read too much into such pledges, because at the end of the day, what we've got to understand here is that Donald Trump is probably the most open and also most affirmative of China member of his entire cabinet and administration. And as much as he's surrounded by individuals who would, of course, be obsequious and sycophantic around him, at the end of the day, he's constrained by a lot of structural bottlenecks and constraints in both DC and beyond, including amongst his backers as well. And symmetrically on the Chinese side, Beijing perceives, this meeting, it perceives itself as coming at it from a position of strength. Whether or not that's true is not a matter, but at very least on a table, it is not China that's currently struck in a crisis involving another regional power that has resulted in, of course, a logjam and also serious bottlenecks to energy supply. It is not China that's currently caught in domestic turmoil and also significant umbrage from the opposition over the perceived abuses of executive powers. And whilst one might credit the American system for the existence of checks and balances and nominal guarantees that these abuses of power do not occur, it does strike me that Beijing is fairly confident entering into this summit. So long story short, there's a lot of noise, a lot of fanfare, but I wouldn't expect too much coming out of this meeting in terms of actual deliverables and concrete follow-throughs.
As you mentioned, there seems to be asymmetry when it comes to how both sides are coming to the table, given geopolitics. Then could we say that there's any common ground on Iran between the U.S. and China? We know that China has been trying to actively take this role as like a peacemaker, but is there a chance of China coming to aid Washington in any way?
So, sure, both Beijing and Washington have a shared interest in ensuring that the situation does not spiral out of control and that the hardliners in Tehran do not get to dictate unilaterally what goes on over the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, Beijing also doesn't want to see further fissures and rifts between the Arab states and Iran, insofar as China is keen to do business with both Iran and also Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, right? So there's definitely an incentive to keep the situation there under control to some extent. But I would flag two caveats. And the first is, at the end of the day, this mess that we're currently seeing unfolding over the Strait, it's by and large a US-induced crisis. It is not to say that the US is entirely at fault, but it needs to recognize, right, that ultimately when you instigate, when you poke, essentially a tiger, even a sleeping and a wounded one in its eye, and a tiger retaliates, it is only inevitable that that's going to create significant headaches for all parties involved, especially ASEAN states, especially countries in Asia that are bearing the brunt of the current Strait of Hormuz crisis. And so I don't think Beijing is in the mood of helping, a problem creator solve the problems that's been generated through their own really imprudence and also the supercilious approach, the cavalier approach with which Washington has approached international relations over the past 15 to 16 months. And the second observation is, as much as Beijing would like to exert influence over the Iranians, bear in mind the IRGC, the hardliners within Tehran, are not particularly responsive to external pressures. Not from Russia, not from China, and certainly not from the proverbial West. And that's also why the primary interlocutors we've seen coming out of Tehran, talking to Beijing and also Washington, have been those on the civilian side. But as I warned numerous times in the past, the more military aggression there is and the more military pressure is exercised over Iran, the less likely it is that these civilians and relative moderates, relative being the emphasized word here, would have a say over how decision-making actually plays out. And the fact of the matter is the hardliners have indeed taken over the decision-making process and also hijacked, by and large, a deliberative, consultative and agenda-setting, processes within Iran today. So I'm not too optimistic about an end to this crisis at hand. Even if there's a truce, even if there's a ceasefire, it's at best fragile and at worst really just a cover and also, paving over serious fissures and cracks that cannot be and will not be ameliorated over the coming months.
I want to jump on what you just said. You've mentioned that given that this is a U.S.-induced war, Beijing might not be too happy with especially Trump's way of addressing this situation. And what's making that worse is Trump's messaging has been inconsistent with the sensitive issue of Taiwan. So let's go into that. How should governments in the region interpret that message?
Well, firstly, I would neither take Trump's words seriously nor literally. I wouldn't take them seriously because he changes his mind, basically every hour or so. I wouldn't take them literally either because he is duplicitous and clearly forgetful over his words. But with that said, I will take Trump's actions quite seriously. And that's also where we have to bring in, of course, the inevitable Chinese prophet. Watch what one does as opposed to listen to what one says, right? So you've got to observe the actions of Washington, D.C. Whilst on paper and on the surface, there seems to be a new narrative coming out of the White House over the past couple of days where Trump seems keen and open to sort of applying a degree of moratorium on perceived American support for the unilateral actions of Taiwan, at least in the eyes of Beijing. I wouldn't place too much faith in this sort of prevarication or oscillation coming from Washington, because by and large, what could well come out of the summit is essentially a very abstract, a very vague, and also amorphous feel-good statement, a bromide that Washington puts out to placate Beijing, only for Washington to walk back on its professed words a couple of weeks or months later. And of course, Trump supporters would say, oh, look, this is the art of the deal. This is essentially the president, exercising great restraint and also great acumen. But in practice, what's really going on here is Trump doesn't have a clue as to what to do with Taiwan. And frankly, whoever has the last word and makes, the pitch to him as the last one out of the room is able to sway him, for the next 10 to 14 days, only for him to change his mind. It could be a matter of hours, could be a matter of days, could be a matter of weeks. So in all honesty, there's no predictability over Trump's position when it comes to Taiwan. And I think Beijing knows that, right? Which is why this meeting is less about a genuine reimagination of cross-straits relations or a resolution to Sino-American tensions and disputes over Taiwan. That's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. What's merely going to happen is really a very artful kicking down the road of the can, and also really an attempt to sustain, the current pause on trade war hostilities, as well as active acute militarization over Taiwan Strait and also South China Sea. That's really the two sort of ticking time bombs that I guess both sides would be keen on diffusing and just kicking a can down the road, so to speak, for subsequent resolution in the future.
Right. As you mentioned, one of the ticking time bombs being trade. It's been an issue for such a long time with Trump's return. Has the pressure genuinely eased, or do you think this is simply a temporary pause before the next round of escalation?
Let's put it this way. When Donald Trump went upon his liberation crusade last year, what we saw coming out of it was a panic dumping of American Treasury bonds, not by China, mind you, but by other stakeholders involved in this situation. We also saw the threat and the risk of immense spiking of prices and inflation, hyperinflation even, the threat of that, right? Potentially derailing his political legitimacy and popularity back home. And of course, when Beijing pulled the rare earth card by weaponizing essentially rare earth supply, that threw, Trump, that caught him off guard. And so, in all honesty, I suppose the American administration has now come to the realization, begrudgingly, that a decoupling from China, especially when it comes to, this sort of poorly premeditated, poorly executed, unilaterally imposed tariffs, it's not in America's interest. It's not in Trump's own political, personal, or financial interest for that to happen. And that is why, on the front of trade, I do anticipate a prolonging of the truce, especially given that America is now enmeshed, of course, in a serious geopolitical crisis with regards to the Strait of Hormuz, but is also potentially plotting a regime change operation in Cuba, given Trump's dissatisfaction. Right. And also, of course, Marco Rubio and a few other Republican contenders need to establish themselves in a run-up to 2028. So in short, there are far too many fires to put out here. I don't think Trump is in the mood of starting another fire. But then again, you never know. For this man does not necessarily act in accordance with the interests of his country. He only acts in accordance with the interests of himself. And that's really, something that we ought to take note around the world.
Right. Far too many fires to put out, but we'll see what actually happens in the upcoming summit. In the meantime, thank you so much for your insight. Brian Wong, fellow at the Center on Contemporary China and the World at the University of Hong Kong.